Emergency Board Subcommittee voted against a temporary funding measure to pay for a limited number of transplants. Mark Hass has the latest. He's in Salem. Mark?
Julie, as you know, the Oregon legislature last year voted to ban state funding for organ transplants. The theory was that thousands of Oregonians may be able to receive some basic health care instead of paying for those costly organ transplants for just a few. That policy has triggered a moral debate ever since.
The organ transplant issue came to an emotional head today, all over a $220,000 request to keep 5 people alive for the next 3 months. 14-year-old Kevin Arneson broke down as friends explained that his mother will die without a new liver.
Kevin, you want to say anything? How are you doing, Kevin?
I just want you to say my mom.
Lawmakers heard more about the publicized death of 7-year-old Kobe Howard, who died in need of a new liver last year. His aunt today said the last days of Kobe's life were spent not at home with family, but at fundraisers.
I ask you, members of the board, if you knew this was one of your children, that they were going to die, and very shortly, and if you didn't have the money or the insurance to pay for the child's transplant, would you want to spend his final days making phone calls and putting cans on store counters and begging for money? It's humiliating, but at this point, it's necessary.
Senator Yee? No. Senator Simmons?
Aye.
Presiding chair?
No. Motion is failed.
Failed on a 3-3 tie vote, with the president of the Senate, John Kitzhaber, also a physician, saying it sets the wrong state policy.
Everybody dies. We cannot keep people alive forever. That is a part of life. What we can do with our limited money is try to reduce the number of deaths to the maximum. Save as many people as we can, because we can't save them all.
With the Senate President and House Speaker using their power to vote in the subcommittee, the legislator who was pushing for the funding said he'd been sandbagged.
As it turned out, they came in and stacked the deck on me. It's unfortunate. I'm just overwhelmed. It's an absolute tragedy.
32-year-old Barbara Myrick agrees. She needs a $100,000 lung transplant in the next few months to stay alive.
My hope for a transplant? It doesn't look good. It doesn't look good at all.
Representative Tom Mason says he may bring up the request tomorrow before the full emergency board. He would need a majority, 9 votes of the 17 members on the board, and at this point he admits that would be difficult.
Oh, Mark, it's such an emotional issue. Any idea any hope for these people?
Well, for these people at the current time, there is no hope that they will get any state funding unless, as we said, that vote will be reversed tomorrow when the full board meets. It will not get any easier, though, as far as the public debate is concerned, for those who oppose transplant funding, especially after some votes the emergency board subcommittees took today. One is a $660,000 appropriation for more AIDS education in schools, and another was a $193,000 appropriation to raise the salaries for some people in the state treasurer's office. Those 2 appropriations were approved.
All right, Mark, and we might mention the issue of transplant funding will be the subject of Nightline tonight.
Another request for funding today, and as Lou Frederick reports, it was a meeting of strong emotion and political maneuvering.
Whole concern here.
Representative Tom Mason of Portland wanted the committee to approve a $220,000 fund so that those who have already applied for transplants would get them. It would, he said, make sure that no one else dies before the state comes up with a comprehensive medical policy. 7-year-old Kobe Howard prompted this increased awareness of the state's transplant policy. He died while parents, friends, and others raised money for an organ transplant. The legislature gave organ transplants a lower priority for the money available. But Mason hoped he could convince this committee to approve a stopgap measure. He brought in the families of transplant patients and some of the patients themselves. They argued that the transplants might cost less than simply maintaining a patient, figures disputed by others. There were constant emotional pleas.
Kevin, you want to say anything? How are you doing, Kevin?
I just want you to say my mom.
Evan Arneson's mother needs a new liver soon.
If anything this proves is that it's been absolutely shameful that the state of Oregon has forced these people to turn the possibly last days of their lives into a circus.
But Mason was not successful. Senate President John Kitzhaber and Speaker of the House Vera Katz joined Senator May Yee in opposing the plan. It was an unusual move. Kitzhaber and Katz do not normally vote in this committee, but Kitzhaber, an emergency room physician, said that his political move was intentional. Mason failed to get the necessary votes. He was stunned.
The ramifications of no action today or tomorrow are that some people will probably die.
Kitzhaber faced transplant supporters outside the meeting room.
And what we can do as public policymakers is to try to minimize the number of people that die, and we can try to spend our limited public dollars in a way that will benefit the largest number of people. And I just disagree that the way to do it is on transplants if at the same time you have several 100,000 Oregonians who don't even have access to basic health care. If you had those people at an adequate standard level, then I think that's the time to debate the organ transplant thing.
They're not dying.
They are dying, ma'am. We have 28 neonates that die in our intensive care units every year for lack of prenatal care. Every year, 40,000 nationally.
The last couple of weeks to revive their family.
No, they don't ever have that. They don't ever have that chance. They die from the start because someone didn't invest. That's not the point. They're dead.
There is a point to it.
No, there's not a point.
There is a point to it because these families do suffer more grief. They're having to go through a lot more.
I just fundamentally disagree with that. If you talk to a woman whose child has died, I think she would probably debate with you whether or not your grief is greater than hers. It would. Not very productive, but it might be interesting.
Mason says he may try to get the whole emergency board to take a look at the issue tomorrow and in the future. Lou Frederick, News 8.
Story today. Chuck, in the past, the board has been reluctant to deal with this issue. How did it come up today?
Well, it came up, Shirley, because Representative Tom Mason, a Democrat from Portland, forced the board to consider it. He did so by bringing it up as an amendment to a proposal before one of the emergency board subcommittees that then forced the board to hold a full hearing on this whole issue. Now, that's unusual, but the defeat of the Mason move was produced by yet another very unusual move. The Senate President and House Speaker placed themselves on that subcommittee in order to vote no on the Mason proposal. The decision by the 1987 legislative session to halt the state funding of most transplants was fully debated, though, by the emergency board. Because the state would not pay for his bone marrow transplant, Kobe Howard of Gresham died. He did so in the midst of a family effort to raise private money.
I had to turn Kobe Howard into a marketable product so the public would, in essence, buy him his chance at life.
No state money, McGee told lawmakers, forces an effort to put together a clever fundraiser.
I ask you, members of the board, if you knew this was one of your children, that they were going to die, and very shortly, and if you didn't have the money or the insurance to pay for the child's transplant, would you want to spend his final days making phone calls and putting cans on store counters and begging for money?
Just days ago, 14-year-old Kevin Arneson of Portland takes the lead in another private effort, this one to raise money for a liver transplant for his mother. Kevin's minister told lawmakers today there's no time for debate. Without state money now, Donna Arneson faces death.
Kevin, you want to say anything? Hard doing this, Kevin.
I just want you to say my mom.
It's been absolutely shameful that the state of Oregon has forced these people to turn the possibly last days of their lives into a circus.
Mason's emotional push for transplant money was countered by the two top legislative leaders.
If we were taking away from individuals on Medicaid services that were available to everybody else, that would be inequitable. But that's clearly not the case.
Hundreds of thousands of Oregonians have no private insurance covering transplants, argued Kitzhaber, and they cannot qualify for Medicaid.
What you're really doing is you're asking many taxpayers to buy services for people on public assistance that they can't even get for their children.
There is a real health care crisis, said Kitzhaber, but it goes far beyond the transplant issue.
We have a two-tier system of health care in this state and in this country. Medicaid is not the bottom tier. The bottom tier is that large group of Oregonians, 37 million Americans, who are being excluded from the health care system because they don't have insurance and don't have the opportunity to be on public assistance.
On a 3-3 tie vote in that subcommittee, the Kitzhaber viewpoint carried the day. The move to refund transplants died. Now, Representative Mason says that he is going to try to revive this whole issue tomorrow before the full emergency board, but whether or not he has the votes in order to win there seems very doubtful at this point, Shirley and Mark.
Well, Chuck, what happens with this question of providing health care for all the Oregonians that Kitzhaber was talking about?
Well, there is a plan of some sorts underway by the Kitzhaber Cats wing of the party, and that is to have several interim committees working on something that will go before the 1989 legislative session. The basic idea is to get a group of folks together and try to determine, with limited state money, a system of priorities. What should we pay for first, second, third, on down the line in the way of public health care? And then we will apply state monies to those priorities depending on how much state money we have available. But that's something that will probably go before the '89 legislative session.
Okay, thank you.
Because someone didn't invest.
Surrounding
That's
their
not
death.
the point. They're dead.
There is a point to
No,
it.
there's not a point to it.
The tension continued inside the subcommittee meeting.
And if you didn't have the money or the insurance to pay for the child's transplant, would you want to spend his final days making phone calls and putting cans on store counters and begging for money? It's humiliating, but at this point it's necessary.
McGee and others were allowed to testify after a motion was made by Representative Tom Mason to spend $250,000 for an interim transplant program. The organized pleas turned emotional as this boy asked for help for his mother who needs a transplant.
Kevin, you want to say anything? Arguing, Kevin.
I just want you to say my role.
But this wasn't enough to persuade members to approve the request. With the committee chairman ill, the House Speaker and the Senate President took control, both opposing the proposed motion.
We will have put a small Band-Aid on the tip of a very large iceberg, and we will pat ourselves in the back and go home saying that we have, in fact, dealt with this problem.
You'll be back 3 months from now for another bite, and another bite, and another bite. And either you deal with it as a policy issue and make your decision and fund the whole thing or don't fund it at all until we have a closer review.
The additional votes meant a 3-3 tie and a failed motion. Mason cried foul.
As it turned out, they came in and stacked the deck on me. It's unfortunate. I'm just overwhelmed. It's an absolute tragedy.
This woman, who needs a heart and lung transplant, came from Medford with hopes that legislators would change their minds.
Yeah, I was pretty disappointed because there's some people, you know, it gets to me because I'm close to it, and if I know that there's help for them somewhere, and then they can't get it.
And when she's gone, her family's going to be saying, what could we have done more than we didn't do? And it's not fair to people like her.
Well, that is the ramification. The ramification is that due to lack of action, people will probably die.
Mason plans to try and resurrect his proposal at tomorrow's full board meeting. Mason will not have to seek the more difficult-to-obtain suspension of rules to bring this issue to the board tomorrow, but he will need a simple majority, and that may not be so simple. As it appears now, the members of the board are fairly evenly divided on the issue, and that means the swing vote may fall to the newest member of the board, who was just appointed by the Speaker of the House. At the state capitol, Trish Nyworth, the 10 o'clock news.
Kim Inslee is here with an update on this emotional issue. Kim, are there any signs that the money is drying up?
There are a lot of signs. In one case, organizations that have pledged money are now saying they aren't interested in giving anymore. This attitude is bringing up an uncomfortable question, and that is, if the state won't pay and we won't pay, what's going to happen to these transplant patients?
I just want you to say my role.
Evan Arneson's plea did not exactly fall on deaf ears, but the legislative subcommittee hearing his case did not give Evan the news he needs. Evan's mother will die unless she has a liver transplant. She has no insurance to pay for the operation. Last year, the Oregon legislature ended funding for most transplants and opted for a plan to increase funding for prenatal care and children's medical care. Thursday, a legislative emergency board subcommittee defeated a plan to restore funding, in spite of pleas from families directly affected. Senate President John Kitzhaber opposes funding, saying a broader state health policy is needed that covers all Oregonians, not just those on Medicaid.
If we were taking away from individuals on Medicaid services that were available to everybody else, that would be inequitable. But that's clearly not the case.
That leaves individuals who aren't insured or who are underinsured with no choice but to raise the money themselves. Fundraisers for Twyla Bozeman, an Aloha woman undergoing a bone marrow transplant this week, raised enough money for her operation, but not enough to pay for the follow-up care she needs. Some companies that promised money are now backing out. Joe Haverkamp, a veteran fundraiser in charge of Bozeman's efforts, says the public is losing interest in transplant cases, and donations from the private sector are drying up.
They get to a point where they're saturated with a certain issue. And then you go to another fundraiser and it's something fresh in their mind, and then then they're willing to give.
Haverkamp needs an additional $10,000 to $15,000 for Twyla Bozeman. She believes future transplant patients will have a much tougher time getting funds. Tomorrow in Salem, the full Legislative Emergency Board will vote on the fundraising issue. Right now, it looks like the plan to restore funding will not pass.
And we'll have a report on that tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Thanks, Kim.
A jumbo jet.
The Legislative Emergency Board refused to restore funding for transplants. Portland Representative Tom Mason wanted $220,000 to make sure no one else dies because they cannot afford the operation. That's what happened to 7-year-old Kobe Howard, landing the issue in the public spotlight. Kevin Arneson fears his mother will be next unless she gets a new liver.
Kevin, you want to say anything? Hard doing it, Kevin.
I just want you to say my mom.
The effort failed. The committee will stand with the current policy that the money can be better spent on many low-income people instead of just a few with extraordinary needs.
The toughest new debate in health care is over rationing, reducing the skyrocketing cost of the nation's medical system by reducing the treatments and services available. We have a for instance, the decision last year by the state of Oregon to stop paying for some life-saving organ transplants. It has forced some to mount public appeals for funds, among other things, as we see in this report by Lee Hochberg of public station KCTS in Seattle.
See, it makes your face bigger. Television viewers in Oregon have gotten used to pictures like this in recent months. Pictures of a dying child desperately pleading for money to afford some life-saving medical procedure.
I'm gonna get money in them.
These pictures of 7-year-old Kobe Howard of Portland, Oregon, were taken in November. Kobe had leukemia. He needed $100,000 for a bone marrow transplant. Made-for-TV fundraising events like this one have become regular staples on the evening news. Television cameras followed Kobe on a Thanksgiving Day trolley ride. All $1,500 from the day's runs went to his transplant fund. But raising money a nickel and dime at a time, the 7-year-old boy was able to raise only $70,000 before his advancing leukemia outraced him. He died shortly after Thanksgiving. Kobe Howard was the first victim of a controversial decision Oregon state legislators made last summer to end government funding for residents in need of heart, liver, pancreas, and bone marrow transplants. The decision has spawned a macabre environment where dying residents racing the clock have been forced to beg and compete against each other for donated dollars to help keep them alive.
It's been just disgusting. These people could be in the last days of their lives, and we have made them go out and market themselves. Kobe Howard's the best example of that. Kobe Howard would be terribly ill. He'd be vomiting in the bathroom. His aunt would take him out and say, "Kobe, you've got to smile now. Cameras are coming over." They would be distributing little cans in grocery stores with Kobe's picture on it. And Kobe would have to go around literally marketing himself, turning himself into some type of sideshow thing.
Lower cave is open. Are you seeing that liver pink up?
A transplant operation like this can cost between $100,000 and $200,000. Oregon used to help residents who couldn't afford the expensive procedures. But last summer, the state decided it couldn't afford to pay for the expensive procedures any longer. It ended state funding for transplants, instead spending dollars from the transplant fund to construct a cottage at a state reform school. Senate President John Kitzhaber, a physician, explains why.
There are finite dollars that we can expend on health care. We're not going to close the schools. We're not going to turn the prisoners loose. We're not going to abandon clean water and clean air. You have other priorities that society has to invest in.
The decision to end transplant funding largely went unnoticed until Kobe Howard's death. Now, critics across the state say the government could have prevented that tragedy. There was plenty of money available that could have saved the young boy.
I would maintain that saving a child's life is just about the most important thing a government can do. We spend money in this state for such things as 4-H prizes. We have a $4 million program that buys 4-H prizes at county fairs. We put $2 million into art. We put $1 million into extra legislative salaries. We put $1 million into the governor's office, million after million after million.
How many transplants would that cover?
$2 million? $2 million would cover even more transplants than we need. The projected need right now is for about 30 transplants, and they say it will cost about $738,000. So the question is not dollars.
Transplants don't cost the state much because when the state pays for part of the procedure, the federal government pays for the rest. A $100,000 transplant, for example, costs the state only $25,000. Under political pressure, proponents of the state's new policy have admitted that money for the transplant program is available and could have been spent to save Kobe Howard. But Senate President Kitzhaber has argued strongly that the state was right not to spend those dollars on Kobe. He says, painful or not, it's time for government to draw the line on what types of medical procedures it will fund.
They wanted $200,000 to keep the transplant program going for a short period of time for about 5 individuals. And we did have the money. There's no question about it. But you have to ask yourself, what is the policy of what, that's guiding what you're doing? You've developed a sham policy that's unsustainable. You're building up people's expectations in a way that does not offer any hope that you can fulfill them.
Kitzhaber says a more sensible health policy would spend more money on prenatal care, which could help thousands of poor Oregonians, rather than on expensive, catastrophic surgeries that can help only 30 to 35 people per year.
It makes a great deal of more sense to produce healthy, viable babies than to essentially practice rescue medicine for a small number of people.
Could you say that to Kobe Howard's aunt?
I did. I sat and looked across the hearing table at Kobe Howard's aunt, at Craig Irwin's mother, at Mrs. Arneson's son, and I told them that I empathized with them, and I also told them that we did not have enough money to do everything for everybody. Everybody dies. I mean, death is a part of life. It's not an adverse outcome. It's a natural part of, and no one gets out of life alive. It's a fatal condition.
Is death part of life for a 2-year-old boy? Is that a normal, is that something that would normally happen?
Hospice volunteer Sharon Place has spent the months since the state's decision trying to raise funds for 2-year-old David Holliday. David has leukemia. Doctors say he needs a $100,000 bone marrow transplant to survive. In rural Roseburg, Oregon, the family's been able to raise only $3,000, and the state, following its new policy, has been unwilling to help.
He sits home day after day in a semi-sitting, laying down position. He's uncomfortable. He's in pain. I think he's sitting there wondering who is going to help him. You see it in his face, he's wondering who's going to step forward and be the one to help him.
Knowing that the money's there and knowing that he can live, I just don't believe this is God's will.
In a desperate spectacle, not unlike Kobe Howard's 11th hour struggle for survival, David's mother recently drove the sick boy 150 miles to the state capitol in Salem to beg for emergency funds for a transplant.
He laid in the stroller. He has a huge abdominal swelling with his liver and spleen. He didn't look like somebody that was enjoying life. He looked like somebody that needed help. And when we were en route to Salem, we were at a restaurant, and there were several people there that noticed how sick David was. And I tell you, they wanted to help. They wanted to help so bad that they called the police. They thought that we were abusing David. And the fact of the matter was, when we got to the meeting, we explained it to them, The people that are abusing David are the state of Oregon by refusing him medical treatment that he needs.
Obviously, to an individual, whatever service they need is of paramount importance. But you have to take, I think, a societal view when you're making these kinds of allocation decisions. So the question is, what is a more efficient use of public dollars, and how can you benefit the largest number of people?
The Oregon legislature rejected David Holliday's plea. The boy has since come down with pneumonia, and his kidneys are failing. His mother issued a public appeal for at least enough dollars to move the family to neighboring Washington state, a state that would fund his bone marrow transplant. And in the circus-like environment that Oregon has become, a family did step forward with enough money to help them move. It was Kobe Howard's family, offering part of the fund that was raised too late to save Kobe's life.
I can't go to sleep at night every night knowing that David Holliday and Adam Sullivan and Renee Coons and on are laying there dying because nobody is doing anything.
Kobe's aunt and mother had already given most of the $70,000 they raised for Kobe to another Oregon girl, 21-year-old Twyla Bozeman, who needed funds for a bone marrow transplant. She's recovering nicely at a Seattle hospital.
I just thought it was like a real gift. I mean, it's something that you can't thank, them enough for.
I remember giving it to her. I started bawling my eyes out.
Which in turn made me bawl.
We spent the end of Kobe's life raising that money, and we raised it for him to live, and it was very difficult for me to have to say, okay, he's gone, here, I want you to have it.